It's the real news. I'm Aaron Matek. Britain has suffered two major attacks in less than 2 weeks, first in Manchester and then in London. As the country mourns and police round up suspects, there is growing talk of how these attacks at home are tied to British actions overseas. The Manchester bomber, Salem Abedi, trained in Libya just as British intelligence helped foreign militants go there to fight Muammar Gaddafi. And now ISIS has claimed responsibility for the London attack, just as the British Home Office is suppressing a report on foreign funding of terrorist groups. The report is said to focus on Saudi Arabia. The British government recently approved the sale of billions of dollars in weapons to the Saudi regime. My guest, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, is an award-winning journalist and author. Along with Mark Curtis, his latest piece is called The Manchester Bombing as Blowback, the Latest Evidence. Now, before we go to this interview, I want to warn you that the audio quality is poor. We had a rough connection with Nafeez, but we thought that this interview was important to get out, even though it's hard to listen to. So this is Nafeez Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So you wrote this briefing claiming that the Manchester bombing was blowback, at least in part, for British government policies. And this briefing came out on the morning of this latest terror attack in London. Can you lay out for us what you found?
So this briefing I put together with my colleague Mark Curtis, who's a well-known British historian and foreign policy expert. And the reason we did this is because we felt that there was a real need to push the national conversation, especially in the run-up to the elections, into a more informed understanding of how we got to this place where we've become so unsafe. And the fundamental argument that we've made is that Britain, over the last few years, especially under the government of May, has allied itself with the very regimes that are sponsoring jihadist groups in a number of theaters, specifically in Syria and Libya. And that at the same time, British security services opened up a kind of an open door policy, allowing British Muslims to go and fight in these theaters of war. And they fought alongside various Islamist militant groups, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Nusra and several other groups, and that they have actually been able to come back, and that there has been a catastrophic failure of intelligence policy and foreign policy in a sense, which has basically made our country extremely vulnerable, and which explains why we've had this astonishing sequence of 3 terrorist attacks over a short period of time of 3 months.
So on that note, let's explore how this dynamic plays out, specifically with the Manchester bombing and the Libyan militants that you mentioned.
So what we're seeing is that Britain, they allied themselves with, in specific, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, among other groups, but they were one of the main groups that were involved for many years in planning and agitating against the Gaddafi regime. And one of the things that we picked out was various State Department cables which showed that the LIG, as is the acronym, was actually known by US officials at the time to be liaising with various Al-Qaeda personnel in the years preceding this kind of planning for the kind of invasion and the kind of overthrow of Gaddafi. So we knew very much that we allied with people, they had these linkages with Al-Qaeda. And around the same time, around 2006, 2007, the US military academy at West Point analysis documents that were found in Iraq, which showed that Libyan fighters connected to this group were basically going to Iraq, and they were fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually metamorphosed into this entity called ISIS. And these same people had gone back to Libya, and they were actually enrolled in the anti-Gaddafi rebellion and operated under kind of US and British coordination. And our main allies at this time were Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, but Qatar in particular came up frequently as a major player in supplying arms and assistance to these rebel movements, and overwhelmingly, according to British officials themselves, hardline Islamist militant groups, many with links to Al-Qaeda. And so what appears to have happened is that this intervention in Libya created this safe haven for many of these groups which had links to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and were operating in different theaters outside of Libya. You know, they were able to come into the vacuum that was created by the collapse of the Libyan state and establish this kind of safe haven environment. And at the same time, we had this astonishing situation where inside the UK, and we now have these revelations emerging in the press over the last few days, that MI6 and MI5 had basically facilitated the movement of various British citizens into these countries, specifically into Libya, to join and fight as part of the rebellion, and to come back without any sorts of repercussions. And the thing is that this is a pattern that we have been seeing over the last few years, not just isolated to Libya, but was also occurring in relation to Syria. I previously interviewed a former British counterterrorism intelligence officer by the name of Charles Bridge, who has talked about how there was this open door policy in relation to Syria. Now, what's happened recently, one of the facts that we brought up in the briefing, is that there's estated 850 Britons overall that went out to these different theatres of war to fight with these jihadist groups, and about half of them reportedly came back in February. So the question really is what has happened? Because it's a crime to go abroad and fight with these groups, and why is it that authorities have done nothing when they came back? And is there a connection between the decrease in public safety and the freedom of operation that many of these individuals appear to have had as a result of their relationship with our own allies and with our security services?
So on this point, let me go to British Prime Minister Theresa May, who, in the aftermath of this newest London terror attack, she said that the attack shows that Britain is too tolerant of extremism.
While we have made significant progress in recent years, there is, to be frank, far too much tolerance of extremism in our country. So we need to become far more robust in identifying it and stamping it out across the public sector and across society.
So Nafeez, that's Theresa May saying that Britain is too tolerant of extremism. The argument you're making, though, appears to be that it's in fact the government that is too tolerant of extremism.
There are all sorts of questions which are perfectly legitimate to ask about whether it's possible for Muslim communities to do more. And I think that's a simple question. There's nobody I know in the Muslim communities who doesn't feel we should do more, isn't trying to do more. And it's totally fine for people to talk about that. But I think the reality is that if we're going to raise this issue of tolerance of extremism in Britain, what we're seeing here, astonishingly, is that this question doesn't just apply to Muslim communities, which is, I think, what Theresa May was trying to insinuate. It actually applies very concretely to Theresa May's own government. And what we're seeing is actually that the policy of tolerating extremism appears to be institutionalized at the highest levels of the British government, where we see elements of our security services, where we see our government's foreign policy establishment actively working with regimes that are known to be the chief sponsors of ISIS. We have our own intelligence agencies producing evidence that shows that this is the case. There is a British government report which Theresa May is suppressing, which identifies Saudi Arabia at the top of terrorist funding, and she doesn't want it to come out, and she's not publishing it. We've got the cable, which was written to Hillary Clinton when he was Secretary of State, which was obtained by WikiLeaks and published, dated 2014, which confirms that the US intelligence community believed that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were at the forefront of funding ISIS and providing military and logistical support to ISIS. So this really raises the fundamental question of, if we're talking about tolerance of extremism, what are our own institutions of power doing in this regard?
And Nafeez, that report you mentioned about Saudi Arabia, can you explain a bit more about what's going on there? This has just come out that the British Home Office might be suppressing it permanently in the aftermath of the British government recently selling Saudi Arabia billions of dollars in new weapons sales. This is a report that was supposed to come out, I believe, in 2016.
So we have this report which the government has commissioned, which has been completed, which, according to a story, there's been a number of press reports on it in The Guardian and The Independent, which suggest from sources that the report basically implicates Saudi Arabia very heavily in terrorist financing. It would not be the first report of its kind. We've had our own former MI6 chief, Richard Dearlove, has come on the record and confirmed that he believes Saudi Arabia is at the forefront of financing Islamist militancy, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We have a number of senior British defense officials and military officials also talked about this. They've given testimony in Parliament about their concerns. None of these concerns have been taken on board in terms of our actual policy. We continue to maintain this very, very direct and cozy alliance with these regimes. And of course, in particular, we have signed off, Theresa May has signed off on a $3.5 billion arms deal with the Saudi regime. So what we're seeing is that we're getting into bed with what all our intelligence agencies are telling us is effectively the world's chief sponsor of the world's most barbaric terrorist entity. And at the same time, we're seeing an acceleration of terrorist attacks on British soil. This is not a coincidence. And a question needs to be asked as to what is being done. That is why I and my colleague Mark says, in this briefing, we are demanding an international a public inquiry, well, an independent public inquiry, but also an inquiry that goes across international borders and asks questions about what it is that we've been doing with these alliances, with these regimes, and how our foreign policy objectives allowed us to undermine our national security systems in this way, to this extent that it is leading directly to loss of life.
Finally, Nafeez, quickly, I'm wondering if you could connect all this to the upcoming election in Britain, just days away. Late last month, you had Jeremy Corbyn saying something unprecedented for a major politician in a Western country, connecting Western foreign policy to terror attacks at home.
Many experts, including professionals in our intelligence and security services, have pointed out the connections between wars that we've been involved in or supported and fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. Protecting this country requires us to be both strong against terrorism and strong against the causes of terrorism. The blame is with the terrorists, but if we are to protect our people, we must be honest about what threatens our security.
Is his message catching on to voters ahead of the vote?
So it's difficult to what extent people are going to respond to all of this discussion that's been going on in the wake of these attacks about the role of the British foreign policy establishment. Jeremy Corbyn has gone out of a limb and basically raised the issue of our relationship with the Gulf regimes, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and rightly asked this question as to whether this relationship is legitimate, and he said that we need to review, and I agree with him. And I do think that this indicates almost certainly is that vast sections of the British public are asking these questions now as to how we got ourselves into this situation where Britain is so deeply unsafe that it almost feels as if we're being subject to an insurgency in our own country. And that has raised the question of, something needs to change and something is seriously wrong. And I think Jeremy Corbyn is asking those questions that many people really want answers to. We're going to have to wait to see on Thursday whether that's going to actually translate in terms of what decisions people make at the poll.
Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, award-winning investigative journalist and author. His latest piece, The Manchester Bombing as Blowback, with Mark Curtis. We'll link to it on our website, therealnews.com. Nafeez, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.